Frank Sinatra Jr. was standing in front of his father's coffin. He was 54 years old, but in that moment, he looked like a lost child. He didn't cry. He didn't say a word. He just stared at that face he had seen on magazine covers, on movie screens, everywhere, except where it truly mattered, at home. Someone placed a hand on his shoulder. He brushed it away with a sharp gesture, and then said something no one expected, something that echoed through the silence of the funeral like a slap. He said, "I was never his son. I was only the son of Frank Sinatra, and that's not the same thing." The room froze because he had just said out loud what the entire family knew, but no one dared to admit. Being the son of the voice, of the chairman of the board, of the man who defined an entire era of American music, was not a privilege. It was a sentence, a life sentence to exist in a shadow so massive that the light never reached you. Frank Sinatra officially left behind three children: Nancy, Frank Jr., and Tina. Three names. Three lives destroyed in completely different ways. But he also left behind other children the world never knew. Children he denied until his final breath. Children who grew up knowing their father was a god to millions. But to them, he was nothing. And there is proof. Documents the family has tried to suppress for decades. Testimonies silenced with money. This video reveals what the Sinatra empire doesn't want you to know. To understand what he did to his children, you first have to understand who Frank Sinatra was. He was born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, an only child of Italian immigrants. His mother, Dolly, was a tough, dominant, controlling woman. She ran an illegal abortion business in the basement of their home. She had political connections, real power, and she used both without hesitation. His father, Marty, was a firefighter, a quiet man who drank in silence and let Dolly make all the decisions. Frank grew up adoring his mother and terrified of disappointing her. When Dolly told him he was destined for greatness, he believed her. And when she told him that nothing mattered more than success, he believed that too. Frank was an only child because Dolly almost died giving birth to him. He weighed nearly 13 pounds. Doctors used forceps that destroyed his left eardrum and left him scarred. Throughout his childhood, Dolly reminded him of that sacrifice, that she had risked her life for him, that he owed her everything. Frank grew up carrying that debt, that guilt, with the certainty that he had to be extraordinary because his mother had paid an extraordinary price. That dynamic destroyed him. He learned that love was transactional, that it came with conditions, that you had to earn it over and over again. And decades later, he would pass that lesson on to his own children. At 24, Frank married Nancy Barbato, a sweet, traditional Italian girl from his neighborhood. Exactly the kind of woman Dolly approved of. They married in 1939. Nancy was 21. She was in love. She believed in the fairy tale. She was completely wrong. 3 years later, Frank became the idol who made teenage girls faint at every concert. Suddenly there was money, fame, women, thousands of women, and Frank accepted all of them. Nancy had 3 children with him: Nancy Jr., born in 1940, Frank Jr. in 1944, and Tina in 1948. 3 children who watched their father become the biggest star on the planet while their family fell apart. Nancy Barbato became an expert at pretending not to know about the affairs, pretending not to hear the rumors, because that was what was expected of her, and the cost was enormous. But here's something very few people know. In 1949, a year after Tina was born, Frank had an affair with a Las Vegas chorus girl named Marilyn Maxwell. The affair lasted 6 months. When she became pregnant, Frank disappeared. Marilyn gave birth in January 1950, a boy. She gave him up for adoption immediately. She had no choice. She was unmarried, an actress. In 1950, having a child out of wedlock destroyed careers. That child, if he's still alive, is now 74 years old. He probably doesn't know who his biological father was. And he wasn't the only one, not the first and not the last. In 1951, Frank met Ava Gardner. Ava was the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. Wild, independent, everything Nancy was not. And Frank became obsessed. It wasn't love, it was possession, a desperate need to conquer the unconquerable. Frank left Nancy publicly with no consideration for his 3 children. He divorced her in October 1951 and married Ava 1 month later. Nancy Jr. was 11. Frank Jr. was 7. Tina was 3. All of them watched their father choose another woman over them. They saw the photos in magazines. That abandonment marked them forever. It taught them that love was temporary, that it could be replaced, that no matter how much you love someone, if something better came along, you would be left behind. The marriage to Ava was a disaster. 6 years of explosive fights, passionate reconciliations, mutual destruction. And in the middle of that chaos was a secret the Sinatra family kept hidden for decades. Ava got pregnant twice. The first time was in 1952. Frank was ecstatic. He wanted that child, but Ava didn't want to give up her career. She didn't want to ruin her body, so she secretly had an abortion at a clinic in London. When Frank found out, something inside him broke in a way that was never repaired. The second time was in 1953. Ava became pregnant again and aborted again. This time Frank knew from the beginning. He begged her on his knees, but she wouldn't change her mind. Many say those abortions were what truly destroyed the marriage. Frank began drinking more. He became more violent, more unpredictable. They divorced in 1957, but they never truly let each other go. Frank loved Ava until the day he died. Every woman who came after her was compared to Ava, and they all lost. While all this was happening, his 3 children were growing up in New Jersey with their mother. Nancy Jr. became the perfect child. She had to be, because if she was perfect, maybe Dad would come back. Maybe Dad would love her. She got the best grades, behaved impeccably, never complained. Because that's what children do when their parents separate. They blame themselves. She developed anxiety. She stopped eating. At 13, she weighed less than 90 pounds. Frank would visit occasionally. He'd arrive in a limousine, bring expensive gifts, stay a few hours, and leave. Nancy Jr. learned that her father's love came in scheduled visits, and gifts meant to compensate for absence. Frank Jr. had it worse. He was the only son, the heir to the name, and with that name came an impossible burden from the moment he could walk. Frank Sr. looked at him with expectations no child should face. He wanted him to be exactly like him. Frank Jr. was 10 when his father made him sing in front of friends. The boy was terrified. His voice cracked. Frank Sr. mocked him in front of everyone, said he sounded like a girl. That moment defined their relationship forever. He began singing professionally at 19, and every review started the same way: the son of Frank Sinatra. He was never Frank Sinatra Jr., the singer. He was always the son of, and that slowly destroyed him. Then came 1963. Frank Jr. was 19. He was in Lake Tahoe preparing for a concert. On December 8th, 2 men knocked on the door, said they were hotel employees. Frank Jr. opened it. They hit him, put a gun to his head, shoved him into a car trunk. He was held captive for 3 days. And the entire time he waited for his father to come save him, to appear like in the movies. The kidnappers demanded $40,000. Frank Sr. negotiated and paid. Frank Jr. was released on December 11th. But rumors started immediately. Rumors that it was all a publicity stunt, that Frank Jr., desperate to escape his father's shadow, had staged his own kidnapping. The rumors were false. The 3 kidnappers were arrested and convicted, but the damage was done. Frank Jr. could never shake the suspicion, and Frank Sr. never publicly defended him, because Frank Sr. had doubts too. Decades later, Frank Jr. confessed something devastating. During those 3 days in captivity, he imagined the rescue. He pictured Frank Sr. bursting in, overpowering the kidnappers, pulling him into his arms. But when he was finally released and saw his father, Frank Sr. didn't hug him. He just looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" Frank Jr. nodded. Frank Sr. replied, "Good. This cost me a fortune. I hope you learn to be more careful." That was it. No hug, no "I love you." Frank Jr. said, "That day I learned that to my father I was a problem to be solved, not a son to be saved." Tina, the youngest, watched everything from the shadows. From an early age, she learned that love in the Sinatra family was conditional. She learned to be invisible, because invisible people survive. She became a television producer, far from the spotlight, as if she'd decided the only way to live was not to compete. For decades, that was enough. But Tina carried secrets, many secrets, because she was the one who listened, the one who saw everything. And in 2000, 2 years after Frank's death, she published a book, My Father's Daughter, a devastating memoir. Nancy Jr. begged her not to publish it, saying it would destroy Frank's legacy. But Tina was tired of being silent. The book exploded. She talked about the infidelities, Frank's violent temper, how he punched walls when enraged, how Nancy Barbato endured years of humiliation. And she talked about something else. She talked about the other children. Because Frank Sinatra didn't have just 3 children. He had more. And this is where the story becomes truly dark. The lawyers demanded that she cease all attempts to contact Frank. But as a gesture of goodwill, they offered her $50,000 in exchange for signing a confidentiality agreement. Francesca was 18 years old. $50,000 was more money than she had ever seen in her life. But signing meant accepting that her very existence was something shameful. She didn't sign. She sent the letter back unopened, the check untouched, and wrote a single sentence: I am not for sale. The lawyers never contacted her again. Neither did Frank. Today, Francesca lives in Tucson, Arizona. She is 57 years old. She works as a nurse. She lives a quiet, ordinary life. Close friends confirm her story. They confirm that she has Frank's blue eyes. They confirm that Dorothea had photos of Francesca with Frank. Photos that mysteriously disappeared after a burglary in 1988. A burglary where nothing else was taken. Only the photos. And here we reach the core of everything. Frank Sinatra didn't know how to love. He knew how to possess. He knew how to control. He knew how to be adored. But love, real love, was something he never learned. His 3 legitimate children grew up competing for scraps of his attention. Nancy trying to be the perfect daughter. Frank Jr., the son who was never enough. Tina, the invisible one. And the others, the unacknowledged, grew up with a void that no success could ever fill. Because there is something uniquely cruel about knowing your father could recognize you, but chooses not to. Frank Jr. spent his entire life trying to be his father. He sang the same songs, used the same arrangements, became a copy, a tribute act to his own father. And he never escaped that shadow. In 1988, Frank Jr. was performing in Atlantic City. He sang My Way. When he finished, a man in the crowd shouted, "Your father did it better." Frank Jr. froze. Then with a smile that never reached his eyes, he said, "I know. Believe me, I know." The audience laughed, but it wasn't a joke. It was a confession. He kept singing for almost 5 decades. He never had a major hit. He was never recognized as an artist in his own right. He died in 2016. He was 72 years old, on tour, singing his father's songs. They found him alone in his hotel room in Daytona Beach. He had died of a heart attack. And the obituary said exactly what he had always feared. Frank Sinatra Jr., son of the legend. Not a talented singer, just the son of. Not even in death could he simply be Frank. Nancy Jr. became the guardian of the legacy after Frank's death in 1998. She took control. She decided what would be published and what would be buried. She protected Frank's image with ferocity. Nancy never married, as if no man could ever compete with her father. She had 2 daughters and raised them while managing her career and Frank's legacy. Her daughters grew up watching their mother dedicate more time to Frank's memory than to them. One of them, A.J. Lambert, became a singer. But she doesn't sing like Frank. She sings alternative music, as if she'd decided the only way to have an identity was to go in the opposite direction. In 2015, A.J. said, "I love my grandfather, but I also know his greatness came at a cost. And that cost was paid by my mother, my uncle, my entire family. And sometimes I wonder if it was worth it." Nancy Jr. didn't speak to her for months afterward. Whenever rumors of other children surfaced, it was Nancy who sent the lawyers, Nancy who paid the settlements, Nancy who made sure the myth remained intact. In 2004, when rumors emerged about a son in Arizona, Nancy personally called the mother, a conversation that was half threat, half plea. She told her that destroying Frank's image wouldn't bring back lost time, and that the Sinatra family had unlimited resources to fight. The woman accepted a settlement. She disappeared, and Nancy returned home feeling victorious, unaware that she had just erased another person, that she had repeated the exact same pattern of denial. In 2018, Nancy published a book, Frank Sinatra, An American Legend. A book filled with beautiful photos. A book that painted Frank as the perfect father. It omitted everything dark, everything painful, everything real. It omitted the affairs, the unrecognized children, the violence, the times he promised to attend school recitals and never showed up, the Christmases spent with other women. When journalists asked about the inconsistencies, Nancy smiled and said, "My father was a complex man, but he was a good man." She neither confirmed nor denied. She simply protected. But there was something Nancy couldn't control. In 2019, a man named Michael Sullivan appeared on a television show. He was 58 years old. He claimed to be Frank Sinatra's son. His mother had worked as a waitress at the Sands Hotel in 1960. Frank seduced her during a 3-month affair. She became pregnant. Michael had no definitive proof, only his mother's testimony. She had died in 2017. And he had his face, a face disturbingly similar to Frank Sinatra's. The same blue eyes, the same crooked smile. Michael asked for a DNA test. He wanted recognition. Not money, recognition. He wanted to exist. The Sinatra family responded with lawyers. Lawsuits were threatened, but Michael didn't back down. The legal battle lasted 8 months. Finally, in October 2020, they reached an out-of-court settlement. Michael received a substantial sum. In exchange, he signed a confidentiality agreement. He could not officially claim to be Frank Sinatra's son. He disappeared like all the others, but he left one final statement. He said, "I don't regret speaking out. Even if legally I can't call myself Frank Sinatra's son, I know the truth. My mother knew the truth, and now you do too. And that's enough." Frank grew up poor. He fought for every scrap of success. And when he achieved it, he developed a simple philosophy. The world is divided into winners and losers, and winners don't apologize. That philosophy took him to the top and destroyed everything he touched. His marriages failed because Frank couldn't be faithful. In his mind, fidelity was for losers. His children grew up broken because Frank couldn't give them the one thing they needed most, his presence. Not his money, not his fame, his presence. And that was the one thing Frank never learned how to give. There was a phrase Frank repeated constantly: "Regret is a word for losers." And that sentence sums up everything. Frank truly believed it. Apologizing was weakness, so he never apologized to anyone for anything. There is one moment that captures it all. It was 1990. Frank was 75. He was in the hospital recovering from a collapse. Nancy Jr. was there. Frank Jr. too. Tina arrived later, all 3 adult children sitting around their dying father's bed. Frank looked at them one by one and said something none of them would ever forget. "I did it my way, and if I had to do it again, I wouldn't change a thing." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He expressed no regret. He simply reaffirmed that he had lived exactly as he wanted, and that the cost, the pain of his children, wasn't his problem. Nancy Jr. cried silently. Frank Jr. left the room. Tina stared at her father with an expression that was half love, half hatred. And there it is, in that one phrase: "I did it my way." The song that defined his career, the philosophy that defined his life, and the sentence that condemned his children. Frank recovered from that collapse. He lived 8 more years. And during those years, his children took care of him, all of them working to preserve the legacy, even as the man himself faded. But there is a moment very few people know about. It was 1994. Frank was 79. He was in Palm Springs. It was night. Tina was visiting him when, without context, Frank suddenly asked, "Do you think I was a bad father?" Tina froze. Frank had never asked anything like that before. She finally said, "I think you were the father you were able to be." Frank nodded, took a drink, and said, "That's not enough, is it?" Tina didn't answer. Frank changed the subject. They never spoke of it again. But that moment showed Tina something important, that her father knew, that on some level Frank was aware of the damage, but acknowledging it publicly was something he simply could not do. And now comes something very few people know, something that rewards your patience for making it this far. There is a document, an alternate will that Frank wrote in 1994. It was never made official, but it exists. An attorney who worked with Frank confirmed its existence in 2018. His name was Martin Kessler. He said Frank called him one night in September 1994 and asked him to come to Palm Springs. Kessler arrived the next day. Frank was alone, holding a list of names written on a yellow legal pad. He told him he wanted to draft a new will, one that included people who were not named in the official one. He gave him 2 names, 2 addresses, and 2 amounts. Kessler drafted the document. Frank signed it and told him to keep it in his own safe. The terms were clear. 2 people were to receive millions of dollars. Attached was a letter in which Frank acknowledged that they were his children and expressed regret for not recognizing them during his lifetime. Frank told Kessler that after his death, this will was to be made public. Kessler stored the document and waited. Frank died in May 1998. Kessler waited, and then he tried to present the alternate will. But there was a problem. The will had disappeared from his safe. The safe hadn't been forced, but the document was gone. Kessler had made copies, but those copies also vanished from his office during a break-in where nothing else was taken. Kessler suspected who was behind it, but he never had proof. And when he tried to speak publicly, he received legal threats so severe that he decided it wasn't worth it. But before he died, he chose to tell the story, because someone needed to know that in the end, Frank tried to do the right thing, and that someone else decided that truth should never come out. Frank Jr. had a ritual. Every year on the anniversary of his father's death, he visited the grave. In 2010, a friend accompanied him once and heard Frank Jr. say, "I did everything you asked of me. I sang your songs. I lived your life. I became your shadow. And for what? So no one would ever see me. I never had a chance to be myself. And now it's too late." He fell silent, then added, "I loved you, but I also hated you for not seeing me, for not valuing me. And the worst part is that even now, 12 years later, I'm still trying to earn your approval. But you'll never say it, because you never said it when you were alive." Frank Jr. cried openly, like a child. 18 months later, he was dead. Some said it was his heart. Those who knew him said it was the weight of living a life that was never truly his. And here is where everything connects, something you might recognize in your own life. Because the story of Frank Sinatra's children isn't just about them, it's about inherited guilt. It's about growing up feeling you have to be someone you're not to earn your parents' love. It's about families where public success hides private failure. Maybe you grew up in someone's shadow too. Maybe you had to be the perfect child, or the one who was never enough, or the invisible one. And if so, then you understand. You understand why Nancy was never allowed to simply be Nancy. Why Frank Jr. died trying to become his father. Why Tina needed to write a book to free herself. Because when your identity is tied to someone else, especially someone larger than life, it can never be free. It can only be a reflection, a shadow. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. He died surrounded by his family, or at least the family he acknowledged. Barbara Marx, his final wife, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., Tina. The unrecognized children weren't there. They weren't invited. Because even in death, Frank controlled who was allowed to be part of his story. The funeral took place 3 days later, a spectacle attended by hundreds of celebrities. It was the funeral of a king. And while the world celebrated his greatness, those children watched from afar, feeling what they had felt their entire lives, that they existed, but they didn't matter. Francesca watched the funeral on television from Arizona. She saw Nancy Jr.'s tears, the endless praise, and felt anger, because no one mentioned the other side, the lives Frank had destroyed. Michael Sullivan watched too, and he felt emptiness, because his mother had spent her entire life loving a man who used her and discarded her. And there are others, maybe 5, maybe 10. People who watched that funeral and felt something, a loss, a grief for something they never had. Frank was buried in Cathedral City, California. His headstone reads, Francis Albert Sinatra, 1915-1998, the best is yet to come. For his children, that phrase is ironic, because for them, the best never came. Frank died before he could fix things, Before he could apologize, before he could recognize all of his children, Nancy Jr. still visits the grave regularly. She brings flowers. She talks about projects to preserve his legacy, as if that's what Frank would want. Tina visits less often. She says she prefers to remember Frank while he was alive, that going to the cemetery only reminds her of everything they lost. And Frank Jr. visited every year until he died himself and was buried beside his father. Finally together, finally without tension, but also without the reconciliation that never came. And now comes the final revelation. In 2022, 24 years after Frank's death, an article appeared about a DNA project tracking unrecognized descendants of celebrities. The project identified 5 individuals with genetic markers strongly consistent with being descendants of Frank Sinatra. 5 people who had never been acknowledged, who lived ordinary lives. The article included anonymous interviews. They all expressed the same feelings: confusion, curiosity, and a sense of loss for something they never had. One said, "I don't know how to feel about it. Does it make me special? Does it make me a victim? Does it make me part of something? Or does it prove I was never part of anything at all?" The article gained immediate attention. It was shared thousands of times. Then everything stopped. 48 hours later, the article was removed. The magazine issued an apology, claiming insufficient verification. The project was contacted by lawyers representing the Sinatra family. They demanded the removal of any reference to Frank. They threatened lawsuits. The project didn't have the resources to fight. The information was removed. The investigation was shut down. Nancy Jr. released a statement saying it was shameful that people would try to exploit Frank's name, that these claims insulted his memory. Once again, the secrets were buried. Frank Sinatra left behind an incomparable musical legacy. My Way, New York, New York, Fly Me to the Moon, songs that defined generations. But he also left behind broken children, buried secrets, and voids no will could ever fill. And maybe that's the real lesson. You can be the greatest in your field and still fail at what matters most. You can have millions of fans and still be alone. You can be adored by the world and still be a stranger to your own family. Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., Tina, all of them spent their lives trying to be enough for a man who never learned to value what he had. The unrecognized children spent their lives trying to be seen by a man who chose to look away. All of them trapped in the same prison. All of them condemned by the same thing: being children of Frank Sinatra. There's a recording from 1996, one of Frank's final interviews. He was asked about his children. At 80 years old, Frank replied, "My kids had everything: money, opportunities, the Sinatra name. What more could they want?" The journalist pressed him, "But did you know them? Did you spend time with them?" Frank fell silent, a long, uncomfortable silence. Then he said, "I gave them what my father never gave me. I gave them success. I gave them a name. That's more than most people get." And there it is. Frank genuinely believed success was love, that money was affection, that a last name was connection, and his children spent their entire lives trying to explain that he was wrong. If you've made it this far, there's something you need to know. This isn't just the story of the Sinatras. It's a pattern that repeats again and again. Children growing up in shadows, secrets protected by money, legacies that are both gifts and curses. So the question is, how many families are living this same story in silence right now? How many children of legends are struggling with wounds no one sees? Because if Frank Sinatra's story teaches us anything, it's that public greatness doesn't guarantee private goodness. Talent is not the same as decency, and being a legend does not make you a good parent. Maybe it's time we stop idealizing legends. Maybe we start valuing people by how they treat their families, not just by how they entertain strangers. Because songs end, records age, but the damage you do to your children lasts forever. It's passed from generation to generation, and now the question that might keep you awake tonight: what if I told you there's another legendary family living this exact same story right now? A family everyone knows, everyone admires, but whose truth is far darker than anyone imagines. A family where some of the children are screaming for help, but no one hears them because the name is too powerful, too shiny. Do you want to know who it is? Subscribe, because the next story is even more disturbing, more recent, more relevant, And this time, the people involved are still alive, still fighting, still trapped. And maybe this time, we can do something. Maybe we can break the cycle. Or maybe we can simply witness it and make sure their stories aren't erased. Because everyone deserves to exist, even the children of legends, especially the children of legends. See you in the next video. Remember, behind every legend, there's a broken family. And that price is paid by real people with real pain. Only here will you hear the full truth. Only here will the forgotten children finally be remembered.